Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder looking at the latest Naval Q&A. This was posted on the 12th of June 2017 by the War Thunder team, so we're going to be having a look through it, giving a few comments and stuff like that. I also now have access to the closed beta test, so when the ships go, on the dev server or wherever they are, I'm going to be able to play them, so I'll be able to get first-hand experience for the ships, and therefore bring it to you guys as well. So anyway, let's get into the first question. Will the aircraft and ground game mechanics concept remain the same for naval battles? Specifically, will the historical characteristics of the vehicles be more important than balance? And the answer? Historically accurate characteristics are an important part of the game, but it doesn't mean that we do not try to find balance for different types of vehicles. We do it through matchmaking, choosing suitable opponents for specific vehicles, or through mission tasks and conditions where different vehicle types can gain victory in a different way. So yeah, as simple as that really. It seems like they're going to bring the same matchmaking system that we have in planes and also in tanks. I would be amazed if they changed this in any way. The only real difference is whether we're going to get some of these smaller boats with some of the larger ships. So in the naval testing that we've seen at the moment, we've seen them use a different spawning system. So the smaller boats spawn closer to each other, and then the larger boats spawn on, the outside, basically away from each other at longer distances. So we're going to have to see if they decide to either put all the smaller boats at a lower BR, and then put some of these bigger boats, such as the destroyers that they've shown, at a higher BR, or they're going to mix and match depending on how good the vehicles were in real life. That's going to be something really interesting, which is also going to be affected massively by if we see even larger ships, and even maybe carriers in the future. I think carriers are definitely a long shot. I don't really see anyone talking about them. The next question is, how is shooting at long distances implemented? The answer? At the moment, the main mechanics remain the same as in the first test. A player takes aim himself, distance to the target is calculated automatically, and guns change their elevation angle accordingly. The speed of a player's vehicle and the speed of the target are not taken into account. Players should make corrections themselves. This system, especially with stabilizers, works fine at large distances, but small miscalculation in aiming causes big mistakes in range finding, thus making accurate fire very difficult. We plan to change the aiming mechanics so it will be comfortable at all distances, but keeping such things as range finding, adjustment of fire, can actually improve gameplay of the large distance shooting. So there you go. So my guess is that they're going to add a mechanic which is similar to what we see on such certain higher tier ground vehicles, such as the Leopard. The Leopard has a rangefinder on it that you unlock as a modification, and basically you can use it to see how far the enemy is away and then calculate your shot accordingly. That is how I believe it works already in ships, or at least that's what I saw on some of the streams that I watched. So it's nice to see that system being implemented. There's also partly some player skill involved as well, since the ship does not take into account where the other ship is going or what it's doing. It only takes into account where it is right now when shooting at it. It's going to be interesting when we look at the modifications and the crew skills, because especially in tanks, when we look at the adjustment of fire modification, it makes a massive difference to tanks over even 1 kilometer ranges, or even less than that. The classic example I always like to bring up is the Jagdpanther, which I just can't get through because its gun is so inaccurate at any long range, at even over 0.5. You try and fire the shot straight and it goes 5 meters to the right, and it's completely ridiculous. So if we see this amplified for larger ships, obviously they're shooting at bigger targets, so maybe that reduces the issue overall, but I think there's still going to be some modification which is for adjustment of fire of the guns, and also the crew stuff. I mean, in for the gunner, we have fire precision or something like that for the tanks, and I'm pretty sure, or weapon range finding is another one. I'm pretty sure we will have a skill like that for ships and their crew. So yeah, we'll have to see how much that actually affects how it works in ships. In tanks at the moment, it actually affects it quite a lot, especially at longer ranges, and since these destroyers or even other ships that we haven't seen yet are going to be firing at even more extreme ranges, we're going to have to see how that works. Will adjustment of fire mechanics be implemented? At the moment, we already have these mechanics and they are automatic. If you aim at a target that moves steadily and does not change range, hitting the same target is much easier than hitting a vessel that maneuvers and changes speed. So yeah, they're already in the game. That's basically linked to the answer that they gave above. Basically, you could have copy and pasted the answer over, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. Do you plan to implement varied weather, and will it affect shooting and visibility? It is planned, and we have already implemented various weather types and sea conditions, but while we are testing the core gameplay mechanics, we will be using calmer weather conditions. I think that's fair enough. It's going to be interesting to see how much a choppy sea affects some of these larger ships. I think it would be a bit too extreme to go too far on, you know, the sea being absolutely reckless. You know, maybe, you know, in Pirates of the Caribbean 3 where they're fighting around the whirlpool. Maybe something like that, maybe a bit too far. And even an incredibly choppy sea. When it comes to visibility, in planes, if you play in a night battle and you don't screw with your post-effects settings, and you just rely on your crew and how often you're able to target things, it is incredibly tough to actually be able to see stuff and be actually able to play properly. Same with in tanks, but generally you don't get tank night battles. And I'm definitely going to do a video on why that isn't the case, because, well, it's pretty obvious. Just go and fiddle around with the post-FX settings. But when it comes to weather conditions, I think weather conditions already do affect tanks and planes in the game. At least they used to. When it came to aircraft, wind used to be a big factor. And it sometimes is. I don't know how to explain it, but there is definitely something. When you get to certain altitudes, your plane does tend to vibrate a little bit. So I'm pretty sure we'll see the same thing with ships. I think it is right to focus on the core mechanics instead of different weather conditions, because once you've got them set, then you can throw in as much weather as you want and it'll be very interesting. Will the vessel's size affect the stability of fire when the sea is rough? Answer. You could see it already during the previous tests. Currently the sea is relatively calm for destroyers, but if you choose a light aircraft, such as a torpedo boat, you could feel the difference. So yep, it's going to affect the stability. I mean, it makes sense for it to do. Obviously this will be negated by certain guns having stabilizers and stuff like that, but overall it's generally going to be affected, which is nice, it should be. Will AP and... wait, just going back, wouldn't it be... I wonder how far they're going to go with that, because obviously we have some very quick, smaller boats. I wonder if we're going to start, if we get choppier seas, seeing like ships jump jump off waves and things like that. That would be interesting to see. Will AP and HE round rolls be implemented in a historically accurate manner? We have already described how AP and HE rounds work in our latest devlog. If you want to inflict constant damage, cause local fires, create big breaches above the waterline, use HE shells. If you need to destroy power plants or destroy ammo storage and cause a fire in compartments inside the ship, go for AP rounds but aim accurately. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Generally what happens is certain rounds are just used more than others. It just makes sense. I mean, when you look at tanks or when you look at aircraft, there are certain belts you take in aircraft, there are certain rounds you take in tanks. Obviously Hesh is very much favoured at the higher tiers right now. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all works. There is already destroyers that have been shown which had APHE shells. So will they fill the same role but slightly worse than a full AP or a full HE shell? We're going to have to see. It also really depends on how accurate the guns are going to be when we actually get to play this in open beta. If the guns at long ranges are still kind of accurate, you're going to see a lot of people still use AP, since, you know, smashing engines, smashing ammo storage, and putting holes in the ship is going to be a lot more useful than just creating a fire which can be put out. If they're not as accurate, and maybe you're just looking for a lucky hit and maybe hitting a fire, or just try and do something decently to the ship without having to smash a certain area, then we're going to see much more HE. So it's going to be interesting to see what people decide to do. How accurately will armoring be reproduced? Answer: as accurate as is possible in the game. No worse than for ground vehicles or aircraft, and yes, we divide the armor and construction elements of the vessel. Here's an example of the PR1124 armored boat. So there you go, you can see it. This is the one which has the rockets on the back and also the T-34 turret, wonderfully modeled, and it is set in its sectors. So it's going to be kind of interesting, since most of these boats don't really have a lot of armor. I wonder if that will make HE much more useful, because the HE shells will still have some penetration to them, so maybe they'll be able to knock through some of these ships and do decent damage, even though they don't have the penetration values of the AP. But it's nice to see they're going to be modeled exactly the same as tanks and aircraft. I think that's one of the amazing features of War Thunder, being able to use that armor in X-ray view to have a look at certain vehicles. It's definitely really interesting for me, especially from a historical standpoint, when we look at the X-ray view. Tanking principles? Should we rely on maneuvers or angle the vessel? You might rely on angling in case you have decent armor defense, which will increase or decrease at specific angles. Craft that barely have any armor should not rely on this. It may prove deadly for your vessel. E.g., an AP round may penetrate several compartments, damaging both crew and modules, and even reach the power plants. Maneuvering in this case is much more preferable. So it's basically whatever ship you're using. When all of the ships that we've seen so far do not have a lot of armor on them, even the destroyers do not have a lot of armor. And when it comes to angling, I think it's going to be much more, if we do have the smaller boats running around at the same time as these larger vessels, I think being able to get away from torpedoes and stuff like that is going to be much more needed than angling against shots coming in, especially if you don't get a massive armor bonus. I mean, one of the good things about obviously angling yourself straight towards an enemy is that there's a very narrow area where the enemy can actually hit you. Basically, a lot of shots will go either side. Convergence is going to be something that's going to be interesting. But we're going to have to see. Once again, it comes down to how accurate you can make these guns at longer distances, what these things are going to be firing over. Simple as that, really. If there's a duel between a destroyer and a torpedo boat, the latter has no chances. How can they fight on one map? It's simple. A destroyer will not be able to see a torpedo boat at distances further than 500 meters. I'm joking. Of course, smaller boats have no chance on open waters. That's why we plan to separate maps into several zones. There will be open waters for artillery duels at larger distances, and zones with lots of cover and capture zones. So that's where the smaller boats are actually going to come in handy. Also, it's a nice little dig at World of Warships. But the thing is, like, World of Warships actually has a really good spotting system. And I know for a fact War Thunder will never adopt it, just because it's not incredibly realistic at all. But it's definitely something that you can use to balance the game that War Thunder doesn't have. It's another option which just cannot be used, unfortunately. But yeah, it's nice to see they're not just doing that. Oh, where did that ship go? You know, oh, it's out of my view range. Well, that's great. It looks like smaller boats they're going to try and force smaller boats to be necessary while fighting for capture zones, because it doesn't really matter how many shells you put into an area with a destroyer. If you can't actually get in there and capture the zone, then you're going to be kind of screwed. So if they're going to use gameplay mechanics such as capturing zones and being able to maneuver around smaller islands, and maybe get some shots off with torpedoes off before a destroyer starts coming after you, then you know, I'm okay with that. As long as every map isn't like that and there's a bit of variety, then I think that's a good idea. It means that it really matters what your team composition is. Like if one team has 8 small boats and you only have 2 and you're fighting over these capture zones, then what the hell are you gonna do? Like you're just gonna lose. It also depends on how big the maps is. Yeah, there's a lot of clarification that this question needs. But it's nice to see that they are definitely thinking about some ideas to incorporate smaller boats along with the larger ones. Will shallows be implemented? Meaning that there will be places where boats would be able to operate while destroyers will ground in the shallows. That's an interesting question. Yes, we already have maps with different depth levels that are suitable for craft with a shallow draft, whilst DDs find it impossible to traverse. We also plan to use underwater landscape in the gameplay. That is cool as hell. That is absolutely... that'll be so cool. Can you imagine if, you know, in ground forces how we have the mud? Like, if you go over heavy terrain, you leave, like, massive tire tracks. If you go over snow, you leave tracks. That would be cool. Can you imagine in a ship if a destroyer runs aground and it puts a big wedge into the mud? I think that would be so cool. But it's nice to see there will be areas that the smaller boats can go where the largers can't. So maybe you can set up ambushes, maybe you can lead them to an area which they're going to run aground. But also this means that it could be a little bit dodgy when it comes to these capture zones. If you just leave it so only the small boats can get to the capture zones, then the destroyers kind of become useless unless they can fire into them. Boats and destroyers have depth charges that can be used in battle. Does it mean that there will be specific targets for them? The answer: depth charges for smaller craft can be used as grenades with fuse delay against enemy boats. Alright then. It won't work for DDs, that's why we remove this weaponry from them at the moment. Probably we will have PvE missions with, for example, submarines in the future. Then depth charges can be used for destroyers as well. That will be cool as hell. Also, mines is something that we need to address. I mean, mines is something that doesn't generally get a lot of light, but it is something, a mechanic that could be used for the larger ships and also the smaller ships. But it's nice to see that they see depth charges as grenades. Can you imagine in an arcade battle? It's just going to be chaos on the water. With grenades flying all over the place, with torpedoes bombing about, with high rapid fire guns. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And then shells from bloody destroyers from Project 7Us and tribal class destroyers coming in. Yeah, it's going to be kind of interesting in arcade battles. In realistic, I think it's not really going to be used, but we'll have to see. It also depends on how good the slingshot is, I suppose. But it's an interesting thing to think about. It's nice that they're thinking about that mechanic, even though it's generally not something that a lot of people care about. What do you think about dividing larger ships' controls between several players? One is the commander, second one is responsible for the main caliber guns, third for AA guns and secondary armaments. Our tests have shown that dynamics of the larger ships' battles are slower. That is why dividing controls between several players might not be a good idea. The most exciting and interesting moments are when you have to decide what you should prioritize. Fire from the main guns or take controls of the AA guns to shoot down an incoming torpedo bomber. Dividing controls between players will divide the action as well, which will make it boring for everyone. Moreover, the cooperation problem between random players will still remain. That's true. The cooperation problem will still be there. Maybe the way you fix that is by adding voice chats between, like, you know, people who are in the ship themselves. But I think generally Since they have said that they don't want to do it in tanks, I really doubt they're going to want to do it in ships. And to be quite honest, I think it will just make ships way too powerful. I've already talked about the issues that I have with AA guns, especially when we look at some of the larger ships that might be coming to the game. But when it comes to firing the main guns, I don't really have an issue of if you have like somebody steering the vessel and then somebody firing the main guns. But when it comes to the secondary guns and the AA guns, well, you know, planes are not going to get anywhere near them. It's as simple as that if we look at some of these larger ships. Also, this mechanic I would love to have in the game. Some of my favorite moments in games has been operating a tank with a squad of people. So having 5 people, you know, one loading, one being the gunner, one being the commander, a machine gunner and a driver, and driving around. You could do that in some of the old games such as Red Orchestra. But I understand that it would require a lot of people. Also, the communication isn't there between people. And also, it's just a hell of a lot of work, which I would rather them focus on the core gameplay first. If we get to a point in War Thunder where everything is done, whether it be new vehicles, whether it be cockpits, whether it be, you know, anything like that, whether it be World War mode completely being finished, then maybe focusing on something like this would be a good idea. But for now, since I generally don't think it affects the average player, and the average player probably doesn't even think about it, then generally it's, you know, it's not something to, you know, throw a lot of resources at, because you would have to throw a lot of resources at it, because you'd have to model the interiors of everything. Which ship classes do you plan to introduce after the destroyers? Should we expect destroyer leaders and light cruisers? Cooperation between boats, aircraft and destroyers already causes many problems / questions from the balance point of view, as well as map design, etc. Adding bigger ships that will have an armament advantage over destroyers, similar to what advantage destroyers have over boats, is a more complex task. It is too early to say right now, however we are not completely excluding the possibility of larger ship introduction. So, we're pretty much in a very similar position as we were at the start of the closed beta test, where a lot of people were saying, you know, basically Gaijin had said we're not closed to the larger ships coming in, but also we're just going to test the PT boats out. Then we got the destroyer class, and now we're in the same position for them. So we're gonna have to see. When it comes down to it, we're going to have to see if they add in larger ships. I mean, it seems like they already are thinking about the issues that larger ships create. I mean, there is a big gulf between one of these smaller boats and the destroyers. Imagine a battleship and one of these smaller boats, or a battleship and one of these destroyers. You're going to have to give them advantages over these battleships, and they would come in the form of mines, they would come in the form of smoke screens, they would come in the form of speed and maneuverability. But yeah, it's just a bit dodgy, and that's not even looking at, once again, the aircraft role in this whole situation. Can a ship be destroyed by flooding? Yes, vessels can be destroyed both from a single powerful explosion, for example if hit by a torpedo, or several breaches beneath the waterline. During the test, you should have noticed that if your ship had buoyancy of about 70%, its draft increased, more under the surface. Consequently, with a speed reduction, because your craft was heavier with a few tons of water. So yep, you can flood, which is nice, and it can list and it can sink eventually, which is, you know, something that should be there. So it's nice to see that it is there. Will another player be able to help me with repairs? We are not excluding this possibility, but it's too early to say. Vessels have much more survivability than tanks, and probably there will be no gameplay necessity for this feature. But as I have already mentioned, it is too early to say at this moment. So in tanks, you can repair a teammate, since generally tank combats you are quite close to each other, or at least you should be quite close to each other if you want to support each other. It makes sense if somebody gets hit over a ridge and then they reverse and you can help them repair and then go over the ridge again. With a ship, ships generally don't spend that much time right next to each other. So implementing this would be kind of weird. You would have to increase the area where you can help with repairs, and then it goes into the idea, well, are you getting out all the dinghy boats just to be able to bring out everyone across the way? Or how is this going to work in a general sense? So since, as I said, ships have more survivability, which they do, I mean, you have more guns, you also have all of the mechanics that keep tanks alive, such as FPE, you know, parts repair, everything like that. I generally don't think that it is too bad to not have that mechanic in. I mean, we kind of have it in planes. Sometimes I see it pop up every once in a while, but I don't know if you can actually do it or not. I've never been able to successfully help somebody repair. So, yeah, if it's not implemented in aircraft, probably shouldn't be in ships either. How will smoke screens be implemented? Smoke screens will be implemented similar to what we already have in ground vehicles, and the smoke will make things difficult for the enemy hiding you, but will also obscure your vision, concealing your opponents. I think the way that smoke works in ground forces is really, really good. I generally think it has been implemented in a great way so far. And to bring that to ships, I think is a great idea. Obviously, there are many historical ships that did have either smoke launchers or the ability to create smoke using their exhausts and stuff like that. So it's nice to see that we're going to see that as well. Will it be something that we see on release? I'm not exactly sure. We'll have to see. And also, as I've said before in my smoke video, I really hope that they get rid of that little window where you can still see somebody through the smoke, but I'm sure that'll eventually go away. Maybe it's a bug, who knows. Do you plan PvE missions, convoy defense, search and destroy, submarines, etc.? We already have certain PvE elements in our PvP missions. We have already shown convoys, and this time we had tasks to destroy cargo ships behind enemy lines. In the future, once we decide that PvP mode is more or less prepared and accepted by the players, we are not excluding that PvE will become available. We have PvE for ground and air battles after all. So yeah, they added in air assault and ground assault. I'm pretty sure we're going to get a similar thing for ships, so ship assault or naval assault, and it probably will be very similar to the tank one, where you have enemies coming at you from either side. I would like to point you towards a video that the Mighty Jingles did. I'll just find its name right now, just so I don't cock it up for you. But basically it's showcasing the World of Warships PvE mode, and it is really interesting. The way it works is basically a wave defense, where you're waiting for people to come and help you from an allied point of view. Your ships are worse than the ships coming in, and therefore what you have to do is you have to fend them off in time for your allied ships to get there, and then you can clean them up. It's called World of Warships Operation Juno, the video that Jingles did on his channel. It was done about 4 days ago, so it shouldn't be too hard to find it. I would love to see something like that in War Thunder. I think the way that World of Warships is going, it looks absolutely amazing. So it would be nice to see some similar aspects taken from that and added, such as the PvE stuff. What nation's vessels do you plan to show us? I think that we will show some American and probably Japanese craft. Wunderbar! So, we're going to see everybody's craft. It's going to be interesting to see what the American and Japanese destroyers look like, which class they decide to pick. I've already done a few videos looking at stuff like that, but overall, looking at this Q&A, a lot of questions have actually been answered, which generally don't get answered. A lot of these Q&As could sometimes be a bit wishy-washy, or the questions can sometimes be a bit bizarre, but overall, this seems to be a much more general Q&A about where Naval Forces is going, and that to me excites me. There is nothing really in here that I disagree with. There is obviously that part where Gaijin have said themselves that larger ships are going to bring bigger issues, so they're going to have to look into it more and how it works. But it seems like the community want larger ships, and once again, as I've said, I don't think people understand the negatives that come with that. The bigger the ship you make, the worse you make every other ship. It's as simple as that. I don't know how else to say it. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and in the next few days we'll probably be looking at some replays from you guys, so have a nice day, look forward to that, and I'll see you next time.